I've used a threaded needle since the 4th grade. And that was at the time I started doing embroidery tea towels for my grandmother. And then stitching remained a part of my career or my childhood or adulthood when I started teaching. So I think it's a fitting title because it is a part of my life. And the show is divided up into several categories. And the first category when you walk into the exhibition is on my early work. And all of this work represents art that I did prior to coming to Baylor in 1993. And previous to coming to Baylor, I had gone back to school to get 2 advanced degrees, one in art, an MFA, and a PhD in art education. So my teaching actually started when I came to the University of Houston after teaching in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, for about 6 years in art and elementary education. And so in the 70s and 80s, when I came to the University of Houston, it was important for me to begin a learning process because I'm not sure I learned everything I needed to learn in college in order to teach. But I had enough sense to know how to go about finding materials. So I relied on my background in order to have, at that time, different techniques and materials to utilize in a home economics program, which is now Family and Consumer Sciences. So I was constantly searching for techniques, materials, and processes. And these were in what was called a related art and applied art design classes. So that background from childhood to making projects in related art and craft media classes at the University of Tennessee and Aramont, those are the things I relied on. So the easiest thing for me to go to was embroidery. So these are 2 small pieces. I didn't have lots of materials. Not a lot of people do when they start out, especially in the 70s. And so somehow along the way, I had picked up some threads on the left-hand side that had a lot of texture. So I just started thinking about how I used embroidery as a child. But then I've come back at this point and I'm utilizing the thread in a more creative way, but I'm still using techniques that I learned while embroidering those tea towels. On the right, those are naturally dyed yarns that I picked up at Aramont, and they were done by Mary Frances Davidson. The background fabrics are linen, but that's what I had. And I tended at that point with embroidery to cover part of the fabric, but not all of it. And in these cases, I think it worked. But as I moved on and I needed to stay, say, one day ahead or one project ahead of my students, then I started experimenting with other types of techniques that I learned at Aramont or UT. And so I started applying these fabrics to a background fabric. Again, is stretched over a frame, and then some of the shapes were padded. So that became something like I could pad on top or I could pad from the back, which is a technique called trapunto. And so those places were filled with fiber fill. And at the same time, I began teaching weaving on looms. I really didn't remember how to set up a loom when I went to the University of Houston. At least I didn't think I did. So when I found out I needed to teach weaving, then I had to take classes, and I took some from Margaret Shepard, who was a well-known weaver in Houston at the time. And everything came back immediately on how to set up the loom. And I remember telling me I was her best student. And I thought, well, I'm your best student because I've already done all of this. I just needed a refresher. So while my students were weaving on table looms and floor looms, I thought it is something that to me didn't allow me enough freedom, because you have a warp and a weft and they're perpendicular to each other. I decided, well, I'm going to set up a big frame loom with fabric on it, and I'm going to sew the yarns into that fabric. And that's what I did on these radiating lines. The warps radiate to the edge of the frame, and then I wove them with a needle over and under, over and under. And so that created the radiating lines. And then the background, each section is also set up with individual warps and woven separately. So what I'm doing at this point is covering all of the fabric. And I felt like what I'm doing is making fabric. I'm using a base fabric, and on top of that fabric, I'm creating a new fabric. So that kind of became a focus for me, that I wanted to construct and I wanted to include structure into my work. So my students would go ahead and in another class, which would be off loom, then they started playing around with the type of process that I'm using at this point. And so I move on. So I have moved on. And well, this is another one of the weavings on fabric. That piece is 50 by 54 inches stretch fabric. And while my students in weaving on the loom were doing Egyptian knots, Spanish lace, I also did those techniques by hand on this piece, just to show that they can be done away from the loom. Then I moved on to pull thread work, drawn thread work, which is an old technique used decoratively in fabrics. You could use, they used it to pull threads out to create curtains or in decorative objects. But I placed my fabric on a frame loom, but I have a piece of fabric that's similar to burlap, and I use thumbtacks to hold the fabric in place on the frame so that I pull the tension taut. And I think you can see that on the left in the off-whites at the top. So I pull the threads out, and where you see the whites, that's where the threads had been cut between two warps, and I pulled out the wefts. So I left them hanging in the piece. So when you pull threads out, you're left with a warp. And so I rewove into those warps. And since there was a fabric that I'm working on, then I was able to include embroidery into the technique. And so it's pull thread, rewoven, and stitched. And then this piece, I started entering lots of shows. And so these pieces would be bought immediately. And so this piece was bought by somebody who lived in Arizona. And it's a pull thread work. And you can see where the padded areas are. That's where the drawn thread work was done, and then rewoven and then stitched. And then I applied that to a background fabric on a frame that's 60 inches by 40 inches. And then I continued with the back with a satin stitch and then needle weaving around the top and the bottom edges. So that fabric is completely covered with weaving and stitch. After taking a workshop with Gragariga in Houston, and that was courtesy of the hand weavers of Houston, and my weaving on the frame, which was a ring warp weaving where the warp wraps around the frame. So you have a front warp and you have a back warp. So you can weave on the front and you can weave on the back and create two separate weavings, or you can bring the front and back together to create cubes where you're doing tubular weaving. You go from the front to the back, back to the front. So my piece happened to become very fragmented. So I decided, well, since I'd been setting up frame looms and working with needle weaving as part of the work, I could take my piece and apply it to a frame, which I think was 3 feet by 5 feet. And then I could add other weaving to it, or I could add additional embroidery to it. And then also at this point, wrappings, where I would take some of the warp and wrap to create those, what I'm going to call like worms. Or I could do added wrappings around jute and attach them into the piece. So in attaching the piece, I could form the strips from the weaving and pad them. And then there's some that I think are double woven. And I tried to vary the thickness of the strips in order to create variation in the width. And so I played around with it to create this type of composition. And then I filled in the background with needle weaving and embroidery to cover all the fabric. And again, I'm creating fabric on top of a fabric, and I think I'm constructing. I kept the colors more muted or closely related in values. so that form was more important than color, even though there's a little bit of a change in the color, but it's very neutral because of the whites and the beiges and the grays. And the wrappings gave me an idea on, well, maybe I ought to do a lot of these wrappings. I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment, so I would take the jute and just wrap. I could wrap when I was talking on the telephone. I could wrap on an airplane. I could wrap in a faculty meeting. And so I built up a bank of wrappings that were just in the corner. And then when I thought, well, I've got enough here to maybe do something with, so I set up a frame that was about 3 feet by 4 feet. And I started attaching the wrappings together using a new technique called knotless netting, which in embroidery is called a detached buttonhole stitch. And it's also similar to crocheting and knitting, where you loop the thread to create a fabric. The wrappings were put together using the looping or knotless netting stitch. And so I continued that to the other side. And then I worked the background with the knotless netting. On the right is a detail, and it's also padded. It has a lot of fiber fill in between the top layer and the back layer of fabric that's stretched over a frame. Then I thought, well, I ought to do a whole piece with nothing but knotless netting. And actually, this was a commission piece for a place in Silsbee, Texas. It was over east of Houston. And I called it a landscape. That's kind of what they wanted. And here I did use some color, but at the same time, they're very neutral in the color, and to create light and dark with the grays and the beiges. And it's all the detached buttonhole stitch. And it's also padded. I did it in 3 sections for easy transport. And then that construction continued because, as I said, I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment. And I thought, well, with frame looms, with nails, my students were doing those frame loom weavings. And I thought, well, I'm going to weave strips. So I sat down and I wove strips after strip after strip after strip. And I could shape the strip as I wove them on the loom. And I had hundreds of them. So then I set up 3 different frames. One 40 inches wide, one 50 inches wide, and one 30 inches wide. And each one is 4.5 feet tall. And then I sat down on the floor with the strips and started attaching them to the fabric that stretched over those 3 panels. And I could pad them, and I could turn them on their edge, or I could fold them. And then I just worked out the horizontal lines in with the vertical lines of the strips to create the composition. So it's 10 feet by 3.5 feet or 4.5 feet. And then these are the works that are beginning of the exhibition. And I think there's a lot of attention paid to those cube pieces on the left. And then the next one is something that I actually did in Houston, but I finalized it when I got to Baylor. And then the one on the very end is one of the last needle weavings I did. And that's it right here. And it's in the show. It's my piece. It actually hangs in my bedroom over my guest bedroom bed. And it's all needle woven on stretch fabric. It's 4 feet by 5 feet. Each block that you see, the warps alternate. They either go horizontal or vertical. So they alternate in each of the blocks. And then I use linen and a cotton for the wefts. And I mix the colors in order to create that kind of a tweed effect. And then the cubes. That's what I call cubes. They've been called everything from sugar cubes to I haven't any idea. But the way these developed, one of my students, and I remember her name, Fran Galloway, she worked for a florist while she was going to school. And she brought in some sleeves, candle sleeves. They were sleeves made of fabric that covered candles, the long tapers, I think, that they used in weddings. And she said, I don't know what to do with these. And she said, I'm going to give them to you. So I looked at them. They had a weave that went diagonal. It's a triaxial weave. and they were threads. And I thought, well, I'm just going to start cutting the edges. So I cut them in little tiny pieces, about maybe a 1/16 of an inch, and just cut till I had a bowl full of those things. And so I took some Elmer's glue and mixed the little trimmings with the glue, and I made this dough. And so I took the dough, like on the right-hand side, and I formed them into those cubes with my 2 thumbs and my 2 forefingers. And so I made hundreds, thousands of cubes and just set them aside. And they were all sizes. Then I could add color to them by using acrylic paint. And then I said, well, what am I going to do with these things? So I had to have plexiglass boxes made. So I found a place in Houston that would make my boxes. In this case, he left the very top off. And so I could just drop the cubes into the plexiglass box that he'd made. And then I had to take it back in order for him to put the top on. And there are close-ups. And you can see on the left-hand side where there's not a shadow, some little fibers. They're like a 1/16 of an inch long. Then I decided I could make some smaller pieces. These are 8 inches square. So he made the box and then he left the top off, and then I could insert the little cubes like in the center. So they were put inside. Then I would have to take them back and he would have to put the top on. Then I thought, well, I could press them in from the back to the front. So while they were partially wet on the inside, then I could press them towards the plexiglass front. But in the meantime, I thought, well, you can lay things in. So I started laying things in, little snippets of thread, or I knotted some thread and then cut it into snippets, the little pieces, laid those in, and then I pressed in the cubes on top of that. And these are 2 details, 2 pieces in the show. And then these 2 I have here. Well, the one in the middle is in the show. The one on the right, I just laid the threads in, but you can see how they're pressed in order to keep them side by side, to keep the cube, and then to create the pattern. And on the left, they're just laid in, but I could mark on them. And then 9 patches, as I said earlier, I'd started, most of this was done in Houston, but I finalized it when I got to Waco. But I still think it's something that started before 1993. And then in Houston, I did some work with casement fabrics. And on the right, that is a casement fabric. It's a lino weave. I think if you look closely, you can see where the warps cross, and then the little weft goes through it as a yarn. And so it creates these open spaces. So each of the horizontal and vertical lines in that piece of fabric have been covered with a buttonhole stitch. And a buttonhole stitch is very, very close. And so you can tell on the left, well, I had to cover all those lines because you don't see any white. And so it left little holes, and in the holes I placed French knots. And then when I got to Baylor, I did go ahead and finalize the piece by adding the concentric lines around the square. And then I thought it needed some details, so then the black lines were added using French knots to create a pattern over the background. And a lot of my work just develops as it goes along. I look at it and think, well, it needs something else. Well, this piece definitely needed something else, because when I came to Baylor, it only had that square part of the casement fabric that had been stitched. So I've added to it, then it's been put in a frame, and it just hangs in my house. It's a piece that I really like personally for myself to look at every once in a while. And then the sabbatical work, it's divided into 2 parts. I did get tenure, and at that time I'd applied for a sabbatical, and did receive it at the time of tenure. And I had wanted to continue the French knotted pieces because I did some work with them between 1993 and around 2000. And what I wanted to do was to set up kind of a grid system and work within the grid. And the imagery was to utilize everyday and unrelated imagery for subject matter and to bring it together in a combination. And then the second part I'll explain later: dispersed, dyed, printed, and stitched patchwork and applique. Okay, the French knotted pieces, These are the 5 that are in the show. And the upper right is one of the very first pieces I did. And when you're doing a fringe knot, you can wrap the needle 1 time, 2 times, 3 times. But I wrapped the needle once to make the French knot. And then in the others, I wrapped it twice. So it depended on my working style at that time, how I felt as to whether I could wrap it once and go back into the fabric, or wrap it twice, wrapping the needle twice to go back into the fabric. The 2 on the left-hand side were done after my sabbatical, but I continued with French knots, but they're not done. The top one is not done within the grid system. The bottom one is, but it's a little bit bigger. And so I think you can see in this piece how fine the French knots are. The little background, it's very muted, so that means I only wrap the needle once. But then the black lines that are placed on top, those were wrapped 2 or 3 times in order to define. And they're just shapes that I thought of at the time in working within a grid. And the one on the left was done after the sabbatical. The one on the left was done during the sabbatical by using the star as a motif and to repeat it along with the circles. And the inspiration for this piece came from a book called Mabuti, and it's an African tribe. And I have the book and I love the way they signed. So it was just kind of a memory of what's in that book and how I thought that I could interpret. And it also, when I finished with it, needed something on top. So the black got added white dots and the colored part got the black dots. And this shows how it started. On the right-hand side is how the frame is set up with the 1-inch grid. Each 1-inch square took about 200 hours to do. And so I started with the ladder. Somehow a ladder at that time seemed to be important. And then each square got its own individual marks. And then the little worms, I had to work around them. And I didn't, as I said earlier, did not know what direction any of this would take. It's just that I developed it as I went along. And each one is 10 inches square. And on the right shows the grid system again with the drawing. And again, I can work anywhere. In this case, I started from the center and worked out. The body of the figure, if you look carefully, you can see needle nose pliers for her part of her legs that are included within the dress form. And the cats, that was kind of a shape that I had seen. So I just put the 2 together and made a mirror image. And so this piece is developed around doing a mirror image, having symmetrical symmetry on either side of a center line. On the left, just something again that reminded me of African designs. And on the right, I think I called this one something about liberty, maybe. And I always thought that woman looked like the Statue of Liberty. And that's why I put the star around her. And then the fork and the spoon. The bottle on the right, there was a Clinique bottle of some kind of cosmetic. And I thought, well, I'll use it. And the butterfly was added, and the snail, and the scissors on the right-hand side. So everyday materials, how I could put those together within a composition. And then part 2 had to do with dispersed dyes. I'd always wanted to use like torn paper to create designs. And the only way you can use the dispersed dyes on fabric, you had to mentally decide you're going to work with polyester, because dispersed dyes, the fabric has to have polyester, some synthetic in it. And I thought, well, I'm going to have to break down and use some kind of nylon or polyester. So I went to Houston and took a workshop with Jan Beanie and Jean Littlejohn. And the piece on the left is a result of that workshop. And all the shapes were torn from the paper that had dispersed dyes painted on them. And then you turn the paper upside down, and then you transfer the dye from the paper to the fabric. And that's what you see in this particular image. On the left is the paper with the dispersed dye painted on it, and on the right, I've torn the image out, placed it upside down, and then I've ironed it from the back, and it transfers the image to the fabric. So that's what happened in that piece. And in some places, I use my hand-dyed fabric and applicate them on. And on the right-hand side, you see a detail shot of where the image has been covered with a little black fabric. And that's a nylon scarf that I actually had gotten at Walmart. And so it held things in place. It also kind of made all the fabrics have the same kind of tone by placing the black on the top. And then these are examples of the pieces from my sabbatical. I worked on a larger frame, and so that the work extended further than the 12 inches. And I wanted the work to go around the edge of the frame. So when I would take it off of the larger frame, and then I could staple it to the frame so that the design did extend. And they're called trace markings because I felt like all of the lines that I used in stitch traced elements from the transfers. On the left, all of those images come from the transfers. And I think I related what I did here back to Matisse, when Matisse did his cutouts, and he would just sit in his bed and he would cut shapes, freehand, no markings. And so instead of me cutting them, I tore them. I like the torn edge better. So all of those are torn shapes. You can see right in the very center, that kind of reminds me of a Matisse. And then the outer white light area, that also kind of reminds me of a Matisse. So the shape was cut out, but that's kind of a negative. The green would be the actual positive that's transferred to the polyester fabric, which is a commercial fabric that was gotten at probably a fabric store, had some kind of design on it. And then on the right, I started using some of my own fabric and applicating them together, and then doing the dispersed dyes over the top. And then they are placed under that nylon scarf. And then I continued the trace markings. And these two are done in the same way. On the right, all of those are dispersed dyed transfers. On the left, the fabric at the outer edge with the little grid system, those are actual fabrics underneath the polyester scarf or nylon scarf. And one of the last pieces I did where I decided I wanted to use the edge of those scarves, you know, scarves have a turn back hem on them, and you can see how I've used that black line from the edge of the scarf to create the definition, the divisions of space. It was in a show and actually went in somebody's collection. I don't have that piece anymore. And then somewhere along the way, I met Chungi Lee from Korea, and I became interested in the Korean wrapping cloth. It's called a pojagi, or in some cases it's called pojagi, if it's spelled P-O-J-A-G-I. And Korean wrapping cloths were made sometime between the 1392 and 1910 centuries, made by Korean women. The cloths were constructed using leftover fabrics from their sewing and household items. The women did not have money to buy fabric, so they had to save every scrap of fabric they had in order to utilize them. And they needed to make these pojagi in order to wrap things in, to carry things in, to cover other things, and to store items. And both the royalty and the common folk utilized them. The royalties made their pojagi, or they were made from silk, whereas the common folk used either linen or jute. And on the right-hand side, now just think this piece was done sometime between 1392 and 1910. Look how modern it is, okay? It's comparable to any modernist painting, I'm going to say this, by a man. in the early 20th century. And in the middle, that's another one that has a very geometric pattern, and then on the left. And the seaming could be a regular seam that where you take two pieces of fabric and sew them together, like on the right. And then the middle is a kind of a French seam, which I already knew how to do. And they call it a malio-baki. And then on the left, there's a malio-baki seam used, which is akin to a French seam. And then the third seam is called a geki, and that is a triple stitch, which is very unique to Korean bajagi. And then this is my bajagi that I made at that time. This was around 2000 and probably 9 or 10. And it shows how it can be used to wrap an object in. And inside there is something, but a lot of the bajagi that are used for wrapping cloths would have a tie on, say, that corner of the white and the opposite corner, and then you could tie it. But it's as a wrapping cloth. And then the ones in the show on the left, it's one of two, had to do with obscurity. And I was utilizing fabrics that already were made by a manufacturer. And most of these fabrics were gotten at Hobby Lobby. At one point, they had very unique and unusual fabrics. They don't today, but at one point they did. And on the left, you can see that that fabric is embroidered. And then some of the fabrics were printed. And so I took those fabrics and cut them up and rearranged them through using the bajagi patchwork. And in the layers, there is that scarf that I'd gotten at Walmart, and I just cut shapes out in order to create some type of pattern. And then I added other fabrics between the top layer and the back layer. And so it became a quilt because I had 3 layers, and I was able to enter these into quilt shows. And this was the first piece of the 2, and it did get into Quilt National. And once it was in the show, they tend to sell out a lot of the work that's in Quilt National. So somebody bought it, and that was the end of that piece. So on the right, you can see the different types of fabric that I have used. And again, they came from Hobby Lobby, a dotted Swiss, an embroidered textile, a fabric that's been printed. So all kinds of different types of fabric, but they were cut up, re-sewn together using the seam. And then the hand stitching was used to create patterns within the patterns of the commercial fabrics. And then this is probably the most labor piece that's hanging in the show, because every part of that patchwork is stitched. The background is stitched, the cross part with black thread. And you can see on the right the detail, how much stitching is there. The blue that's in the spaces around the cross, as well as the patches that are laid in between the bajagi patchwork and the back layer. So those pieces were laid in, and then they were stitched in place and then stitched. And that piece probably took well over 200 hours to do. This piece harkens back to my days when I was working on my MFA at Georgia. And those are screen printed images. I call them avalanche twins because I think somewhere in there I see the word avalanche. So I had, in order to keep up with the names of pieces, somehow I had to have an identity for them. And at the time I was doing graphic design or using computer graphics at Georgia, you had to hold the image up before the camera. And in this piece on the left-hand side, you can see my hand in the image. So I was holding up the image from the fashion magazine, and then photographed it, and then it went to the computer, and then I could print it out. And then I made a silk screen and printed it out again. And then the aprons, I had to have some work for a show that was in Costa Rica, and is man plus woman, or woman plus man equals whatever. Don't remember the last word. So Jack Brockett from Dallas and I decided we would work on aprons because we could pack them up very easily to ship them. And so my aprons had to be oversized because I did not want them to be perceived as wearables. And again, I'm using just regular commercial fabrics and patching them together. There's no hand stitching in these. These are all done on the sewing machine to patch them together, but no hand stitching, which is very unusual. So in this case, I think I'm working on the design element and the form, the shape, in order to create emphasis. They were in some shows in Korea, and on the left is an installation behind glass. And then I like the way they displayed the apron. So it was left up to them as to how they would utilize them in a display area. And then stitch statements. This had to do, I think, with storytelling in a way, or looking at newspapers and seeing where unrelated stories happen on the front page. And what I tried to do here was to take images that I collected from newspapers, just various pictures unrelated to each other. And then I thought, well, how am I going to use them? And somewhere along the way, I learned about laminating paper to silk organza. So I looked up a YouTube presentation by a lady from England, and through her YouTube presentation, I learned how to do laminating paper to silk and using matte medium, and then they're hand stitched. So these are the ones in the show. And on the left was one of the earlier pieces I did. And so I had a collection. They were in just a in a folder. And I was able to make an arrangement like a collage on a sheet of plastic. And then over the top of that arrangement of newspaper pieces, I placed a piece of silk organza, pinned it down in place around the outer edge. And then using matte medium and a credit card or a brush, I brushed on the matte medium so that it covered all of the pieces of newspaper, and tried not to have any air bubbles. So you had to squeegee out as much as you could all of the air. So you let that dry, and then you put it in a bucket of water and soften the paper. And from the back, you have to rub all of that paper off, and you're left with the image on the top. And I was able then to take it and hold it in my hand and hand stitch. And then on the right, that was a piece done pretty close to the one on the left. And then the two in the middle were later. So this is a close-up of the one that's on the left, called Face Off Together. And I like a grid. And so sometimes you'll see a grid used in the work. You see these mummy-like figures. Those are figures I've added. So within the pieces, I can add my own drawings, and taking the imagery that's existing within the picture, then I can add my own marks, like I did in the face on the left. Some of the figures are turned sideways, which didn't make any difference. It was just the image itself. The crossword puzzles and the circles and the way I divide the space. And this piece was done in about the same way. And again, it's like bringing different images together to create new storylines, like a newspaper. And I named this one Thousands of Stories because it's on the right-hand side. It's part of the composition. Mixed signals did kind of have a message, I think, with the hamburger and the model and the mother overlooking and keeping her weight down to a model size. So mixing the images, that's why it's called that, to create more of a composition that has some meaning beyond just the shapes themselves of the hamburger and the figures. Our independence, I think the man holding his head, that's what caught my attention for that particular piece. And then this piece is called Structure and Flow. It's in the, it is not on a frame. and utilize the grid system as much as possible. And again, a mixture of imagery. This piece is in the Baylor University book art collection. It's kind of like, I think, a newspaper. It was in a show, and I think Shay saw it, and that was it. He bought it for the book art collection. And then transitionally, I went from doing the lamination of the paper, newspaper, to glue transfers and looking at fashion. Fashion has always, I guess, been a part of my life, starting in grade school when my mother made all of my clothes, and then my taking home economics and going to stores and looking at patterns. And I've always been fascinated by patterns that someone has illustrated. And so what I wanted to do was to look at the envelopes that the patterns come in. And I looked at decades of the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, the times of my mother's youth and my young adulthood. And so I chose patterns for that reason. And then this piece is a combination of the paper lamination and the glue transfers. So the glue transfers are done a little bit different than paper lamination. Glue transfers, the image is on top of the fabric and not underneath the fabric. So you put the glue on the top, which is Jade 711 that I get from Talus in New York City. And then you turn it upside down onto a piece of fabric and get out all the air bubbles, make sure there's a good bond, and let it dry, iron it, and then you take a little piece of terry cloth and some water and you rub off all the paper from the top of the image so that it transfers the image to the fabric. So in this case, the images have been cut up from the glue transfers and the laminated images and then attached to a background. So pattern recall. And these are the pieces in the show. And I started out like in the center where I only used the pattern envelope. That was those three. That's actually the image on the pattern envelope that has been transferred using the glue. And then the borders around are also transfers, and they relate back to fabric design. And they've been done separately, and then they've been sewn on using a sewing machine to create the border around the images. Then the two on the left and the one on the right, they were done by utilizing different styles and different decades in order to bring together the composition. On the right, from two different decades and two different types of images, and they did not have to be in scale with each other. On the left, that is the actual pattern envelope itself. And so they're constructed using the glue transfers of fabric design. And then they're all hand stitched. And then I started including some of the borders within the composition. And so they had to be stretched over a frame. And so I had to sew black fabric around the edge. And that's what you see here. I also like them grouped this way, that if I have enough, then put them all together and that becomes the installation on the wall. And I kind of like that look where they're brought together. And then I started composing on the iPad using different collage and layout applications. And so the three ladies on the left with their hats I don't remember which one I used, but I brought those three together, and then it was a glue transfer. And then when it was printed out and then transferred, then it was stitched, and it's also over frame. This was done in the same way. I did the assemblage on my iPad and then printed it out and did the glue transfer and then hand stitched it. But at this point, I began to like the background fabric showing. And in this case, it's a linen. And linen wrinkles, and you cannot get rid of the wrinkles in linen. And also the stitching takes up a lot of the space. And the edges are torn, or in some places it's a little bit cut. But I like that look. Now this was assembled on an iPad using a collage app, and it was transferred digitally to a patterned fabric, and then I stitched it. And the patterned fabric reminded me of tattoos, so I thought I would call this Tattooed Ladies, or I could have called it Painted Ladies after the houses in San Francisco, but kind of like Tattooed Ladies better. Then some of those pieces that I did with the patterns, I decided I needed to take them off of the frames. So I took these two off, and I liked that just unfinished edge around the composition rather than them being kind of confined. And then to put them together in this way, leaving the linen around and a detail, and another one that's done in that style. And then the last thing that I've done that's in the show would be the books. And that happened after I retired and the lockdown came in 2020, spring of 2020. And I'd always wanted to do books. My students did books. And I have all this fabric and all these embroidery threads and everything I need right here in my little studio. And I thought, well, I don't want to buy anything. So I started looking around at what I had. And also found a lot of cutouts from things in the past that I liked. And when I didn't have anything to do, I would cut them out and put them in a box. And I started using those. And then that's what you see in the gallery. Like the crosses, that was a cross in the fabric. The flowers, that was a fabric where the flowers was the motif. So I cut it out. Also used the negative spaces. And sometimes I would cut the shape. I used silk organza or cotton organza. And that became an overlay to create depth and also change the value. And so it was just a composition laid out over a long length of fabric rather than it being something that would go into a frame. And the stitching on the back is part of the process. Because I've always liked the back of my pieces. I like seeing the stitch where it's not unexpected. On the front, it's more precise. On the back, there's a little bit of irregularity, and I think it has a nice look to it. And then these are the 7 books with the covers. Each book is folded back into its accordion folded format, and then there's a separate cover like a portfolio that goes over it in the style of what's in the book. And this is my process. This is how I worked on them. All of my little cutouts and my needles and threads and everything I needed at that time in little containers. Cut and sew. And on I go. Thank you for watching.
I'm really intrigued by both your journey that moves through some, for lack of a better word, I guess, from like practical realms, your home economics kind of orientation, and even the types of work that you were doing as a child. This idea of I think all of your work that you've talked about today kind of lives in this liminal space between these realms of like artisan and artist. And I don't know if you have more thoughts about that, but I'm really intrigued by this kind of drifting in and out of works of utility, but or referencing works of utility. I mean, a great example, your aprons that you talked about, intending for them to be sized in a way to suggest these are not works of utility, even though they have a lot of reference to that. So I'm not sure what my question is in there, but I'm really intrigued by that kind of journey, hovering in and out of utility and art.
Well, that's my background. I've been an artisan or craftsperson, and I've elevated some of what I've done to art. And I don't know that one can be removed from the other. I think the two have to be connected. And I don't want like the aprons to be perceived, oh, I can go wear that. I can put that on. I'd buy that from my mother. No, I wanted it oversized. So, okay, it references an apron, but yet it's an art piece. Okay, it's not a wearable anymore. And so a lot of this work does reference back. It's like the drawn thread work, because I looked at a book and I found drawn thread work. The threads were pulled out and it was reworked with embroidery to make a decorative treatment. But yet I wanted to utilize it on a different level. I wanted to see what I could do by taking a piece of fabric and stretching it out. And it was my idea. I had no idea what I was doing. So I said thumbtacks. And that way, when I cut threads out and pull threads out, I could take the thumbtacks and undo them and stretch the fabric back so that it was taut in order for me to reweave into it. I couldn't do it. But I did not know what was happening until I got to that point. So a lot of my work I have to figure out as I go through the process. But at the same time, I want to elevate that utilitarian aspect into a higher meaning or higher level. And I was doing construction at that time, creating new fabric, and I didn't want the reference to be curtains or dress a scarf. I didn't want that. Okay, but you couldn't tell that by looking at those pieces, by any of them, or like weaving. When I took weaving at UT, I never made anything like a pillow. I didn't make something that was usable. All my work that was done on loom hung on the wall. Or things that I did that weren't two-dimensional. I did things that were three-dimensional. But again, it wasn't anything utilitarian that my outcome was. It was the reference, but elevated. And I think craft media from the past has been done that way. I think by living in East Tennessee and Western North Carolina, the craft area, that's my area. I've been brought up, and so it's my background. If that makes sense.
It does. Thank you. That's I think that's one of the things that I really love about all of your work is that your whole life journey, your background, your geography is all
there.
part of that story, that you didn't say enough of, that I'm going to do something completely different. I like that it's threaded through there.
Yeah, it is. And I think I'm glad you brought that up, because it makes me feel that what I've done is relevant by those comments. Very much. Thank you.
Well, I have some other questions, but I'm happy to share the microphone. So
yeah, if I could jump in. So one thing, Mary Ruth, that I have a better sense of appreciation for with all your work and all the different phases of your work in particular is all the different techniques that you had to use to make that happen. I guess my question for you is, were there any of those techniques that you talked about that you specifically like developed yourself, or ones that were used for like other mediums that you used in your technique that was kind of different and new?
I think going back to the drawn thread work, that was my idea. I think setting up warps on stretch fabric over a big frame was my idea back in the 70s. That was unique. Nobody had ever seen it done before. I started entering shows, and one day I'm entering shows to get an award. Next day I'm teaching workshops in Houston, San Antonio, Dallas, and other parts of the United States. I didn't know what I was doing. Had no idea. But my students were working avidly in my classes at the University of Houston. But I shared them. I shared them with my students, and I shared them all around this world. I mean, well, in the United States anyway at that time. I hadn't gotten an opportunity to go elsewhere. So I got
One
to
of the
Baylor.
things I have loved is visiting your studio when you're here at Baylor and seeing that relationship with your students, and that you weren't having them do things that were disconnected from you and your own work. That there's so much evidence of your influence and your work kind of spilling over into their own work, and it's just really it was very meaningful for me to see not the professor on this pedestal and the students are doing something that's completely disconnected. And I think that, well, and I know firsthand from talking with your students that is a huge influence, to be able to see that you share what you've created and experimented with, and that you encourage that with your students. I know I said I was going to hand over the microphone. I promise I'll give it back to the crowd here in a minute, but that reminds me of one of the things that you said a few times during your talk, and I really love this about your work, and I'm intrigued by artists that view it this way, this idea of evolution and development and experimentation, that you don't have a carefully mapped out plan when you start your work for exactly what it's going to end up like. And I've enjoyed seeing, hearing you talk about that, but also seeing that unfold with your students, where you say, okay, here's what you've done. What if you tried this? Or what if you veered in a different direction and explored that? I think that's really reflective of what real life and very interesting art looks like. So thank you.
Okay, you mentioned my art. My teaching is the same way. I have no idea how I'm going to manage a class when I start that class. That class happens and evolves as I see what's happening in the class. And that's the same with my work. So that the process is the same from the way I make art and the way I teach art. There is no way I can have a plan at the beginning of class and follow that plan. That happened at the University of Houston when I was teaching there. You're supposed to know day one what you're going to do in November. No way. I gave them a whole schedule for the whole semester. About the second day, I said, tear that up. I cannot follow this. I have to know what you're doing, and I base what I do for you based on what I see happening in this class. You can in certain disciplines do that. I think I see Allison Larson. Who is Allison Larson? Oh, I'm thinking about somebody else. I'm thinking about Katie Larson. Well, in art history, I think you can do that, okay, because you have a set schedule to go by. But in art, the way I teach, I can't do that. I just absolutely cannot. The student is very important to the process. And when whatever that student is doing, our students, I have to base my teaching on what I see happening. And so alter and change as I go. I have to be able to adapt. I've always been able to adapt.
I love that that's your pedagogical approach and your creative art making approach, that it's the same. And I think that's why your students have such a rich experience and love being in your classes.
It keeps me sane. Okay. If I had to follow, because I couldn't do it, there's no way. That's not my makeup. Thank you for that too. That's a very good observance.
I have to make a comment on that this whole conversation thread. When I first came here and I would be in and out of the different studios, I remember I walked into Dr. Smith's and I so it's looking at what the students were doing, and you came over and you said, I think I asked them, you said, oh, this is the felting assignment. They're learning to felt wool. And there was a student, one of the guys who had a bicycle frame, because he was a cyclist. He had taken a stripped down bicycle frame, and he was taking the felt, and instead of working flat or something, had felted the entire bicycle frame. And then from that, he was doing additional work. And I just thought he was so into it. I just thought, oh, wow, this is an amazing professor who allows a student to take what their passion was, and to take what the assignment was, learning to felt, and also applying it in such a way that really spoke to them, where they were coming from, and their creative process. And right away I thought, oh, this is a very unique teacher.
That is true. I do that. I watch the student to see where they want to go and what, their outlook on their particular art, so that everything that's done in that class is not cookie cutter. I don't want it to look like the same assignment. I think Shay could see that in books. You have an assignment, it's called a book. What are you going to do with the book as a form? What are the variations? So you present possibilities, and then you let the students explore from those possibilities, and they can go off on their own tangent. They don't have to follow exactly what I have presented to them. There's something in what I've presented that should stimulate an idea, and they can move in their own direction. And again, that's that adaptability, being able to adapt and see, being observant, also observe what's going on.
At the very beginning, you were talking about, with the warp, moving away from a 45-degree angle warp and writing it. And then you were really talking about playing with materials like the lucite box and the little cubes. And your earlier pieces seem to be very technique, very material oriented. And then more recently, it seemed to become more thematic, that you were taking some of those newspapers and you were kind of putting those together in themes. And I was just kind of curious that when you were doing the earlier technique, were you also thinking thematically, or were we really, can you talk a little bit about sort of just the development in terms of deeper meaning in your pieces, from technique into meaning, if that makes sense?
Early on, Lisa, I was actually learning, and I was learning by doing. And the pieces that were done at the University of Houston, I think the ones that were more meaningful were the cube pieces. And I probably should have mentioned that earlier. That was my technique. I developed that, and I developed it by cutting those little threads that Fran had given to me from those sleeves. Okay, what was I going to do with them? She presented a problem to me, but I think that became more sculptural. So I think that had more meaning. And at that time, I'm not sure that content was so much a part of what my learning was in my classes at the University of Tennessee or at Aramont. It was working with technique and materials, and that tended to be what I did. But materials and technique can also lead to meaning. And I think those pieces to me had more meaning in them. And then at Baylor, I think there was meaning all along, but I didn't know how to express it in the work. I think if I'm using objects from everyday life, I don't know what meaning you as a viewer or a critic would put behind that. But to me, there was meaning in those. But when I got to the doing images that had pictures that related to people, everyday people, seeing them. I mean, you look at a newspaper, you look at a magazine, and you're seeing images and words. Okay, so I was trying to take the stitch statements and bring everyday items into play to create stories, like a newspaper creates stories, but they're all unrelated on the front page. There might be something about sports, there could be something political, there could be something about movies, it could be something about around the world in another part of the country. Okay, So they are all unrelated images, but I'm thinking that I'm making stories, but it might be up to you to create the story based on what you see and what I've put together. I don't know that I'm creating meaning in the images I've chosen, except that they personally mean something to me when I select them. Like in Face Off Together, there's a nurse in there, and that represents my mother. There's a needle in there that could represent her career as a nurse. There's fashion in there, and it represents my interest in fashion. So all of those pictures that I collect, they have to be meaning to me. And so I'm representing them in a different form to create a story.